So for this next session, I want to talk to you about words, because I've been thinking about words a lot lately. I mean, they ask a lot from us, don't you think? I mean, they carry history, they carry perception, they subtly signal who belongs and who doesn't. And as someone who works in media firsthand, I've seen how language carries the very infrastructure that guides our decisions and that goes to influence policy, innovation, and it goes to influence our everyday interactions before we even realize it. And clearly, I feel passionately enough about this that I named a media platform Cripple Media. And that wasn't about shock, though. It was about intention. It was about reclaiming language and questioning who gets to decide what is acceptable, what is powerful, or what is limiting. So at the beginning of Zero Conference this year, this feels like the right moment to pause and to reflect. Not to prescribe a perfect vocabulary, but to examine our habits, our assumptions, and most importantly, what are the shortcuts that we're taking? Because if we want a world with zero barriers, we have to be intentional about the way we speak. And this really doesn't mean about having a perfect vocabulary, but it does have to do with being willing to evolve and grow. So please join me in welcoming the speakers for this next session.
Hello. We will be ready in 30 seconds. We will be ready in 25 seconds. So welcome everyone to this first couch session of this year's Zero Project Conference. We speak, as we do in all panels and in all couches, but we speak about how to speak, as our great MC already announced. So it's about the language of disability, how to speak about disability. I'm really glad that we brought this session together and that I have three distinguished speakers and panelists here with me today. I'm starting with a person to my right, Brendan Ward. Brendan is a disability strategist, educator, and leadership coach with extensive academic and business experience, currently based in London, if I'm right. To my far right is Sarah Todd. Sarah is a freelance facilitator, researcher, and trainer. Much of her work focuses on the intersections of disability with women's and youth issues, with particular expertise in inclusive facilitation and inclusive communication. Her email signature reads, "I aim to be an inclusive communicator. If you have any communication-related access requirements, please feel free to share them with me." To my left is Jesus Angel Celada Perez, if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Jesus is a senior civil servant at the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation. He has spent more than 14 years working on the rights of persons with disabilities from a public administration perspective, and since June 2025, he has served as ambassador at large for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So in this session, we will jointly explore the fundamentals of respectful, but at the same time, effective language. Language is about communication. You want to achieve something when you speak, and so it's also about efficiency. We will touch upon the history. We will touch upon some key resources to look at and watch, about influences the language that we're using, about the differences between regions and contexts, and especially also about language relating to persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. Our panelists bring three distinct perspectives into this discussion, and that's also why I'm really glad to have this group here with me. We have public administration, which must develop clear, comprehensive, and actionable policies. We have activism and advocacy, which aims to persuade, to shift narratives, and to change mindsets. And we have academia and teaching, which shapes in many different ways how future professionals and basically then everyone think and speak about disability. We will touch upon easy to understand and easy language, and we will also look at approaches that differ between countries. For example, and most prominently, disabled people versus persons with disabilities, and then we will dive into that part directly, which is currently at the heart of many discussions, I trust, not only we are having, but you as well. There are some important issues that are related to language that we will not touch upon, since we have just 40 minutes, 32 and 28 seconds at this stage, at this moment. So there are still some topics that we won't touch upon. So apologies, for example, about we won't go a lot into sign language and also into the deaf communications and the deaf community. We've agreed on a format that we hope will be both informative and engaging. I've prepared 6 questions. Each panelist will start with a question they have already seen in a set order that we all know, and the other panelists are then invited to come in and augment and comment on the first intervention, and if we are exhausted with that, we move on to the next question. So let's start. I'm starting with you, Sarah, and dive straight into the topic so that we don't go a lot into theory. There is this topic that I already mentioned. How do we navigate language when it's so culturally rooted and constantly evolving and evolving also differently in different places? And to use this example, we have disabled people, which is developed and cultivated and comes from UK, a little from the US, and everyone else, especially those who are non-native language users like me, we are fully committed to persons with disabilities. So how's your take on that?
So I would describe myself as a disabled person. I'm a wheelchair user and I'm neurodivergent. As you rightly mentioned, language is so culturally kind of bound and it's also evolving. These are not the words that I would necessarily use to describe myself even 10 years ago. But they're the words that I'm choosing now because they help explain my identity. And I think that's one of the really key challenges around language. We need to make sure that we are flexible to how our understanding of our own identities and disability more broadly changes over time. We heard at the opening ceremony that this marks the 20th year of the UNCRPD. Now, personally, as a native English speaker who prefers the term disabled people, I blame the UNCRPD for the fact that persons with disabilities is now the more globally accepted term. Now, that's absolutely fine, and I actually think it makes a lot of sense. Normally, when I'm on an international stage, I change the language I use to be more acceptable in international circles because I understand that, for example, persons with disabilities translates better into lots of different languages than disabled people. However, for me, using the term disabled people and neurodivergent are about my own self-empowerment, but also acknowledging where I perceive the barriers that I experience to come from. So when I say disabled people, I am saying that as an acknowledgement that I am disabled by society. I'm also saying it because for me, being disabled is an integral part of my identity. It cannot be taken away from me. It's not an add-on, which is why, as a native English speaker, I struggle with the term with, because it sounds like that's something I've chosen, whereas actually it's just inherently who I am and part of my experience of the world. But I think we need to make sure that people are allowed to use the language that they feel comfortable with, and being exposed to different ways of talking about yourself and other people is really, really important. When I work with organisations looking at inclusive language, the best piece of advice I can ever give them is use the language that someone uses to describe themselves, to describe them. Now, obviously, we often have to talk about disability when we're not talking about a specific individual. And in that case, I'm of the opinion that we should use what is practically most sensible in the scenario that we're in. So internationally, I will say I'm a person with a disability because I know that that is more widely understood. If I used that in the UK, people would assume that I didn't understand the social model of disability and that I wasn't an activist. So in the UK, I use disabled person. Now in my private life, I probably would also use disabled person, but that's because it's what I've been culturally brought up with and how I understand my own identity.
Thank you, Sarah. I trust. Brendan, I trust you have something to add here.
I do indeed. So the context point that Zara mentioned is so relevant. In the US, where I lived and worked for many years, I am legally blind. Not illegally blind, but legally blind. In Ireland, where I grew up, I am vision impaired. Or in rural Monaghan, where my folks live on the farm roundabout, what do they say about Brendan? He might not see that well. And in the UK, where I live, in London, I'm partially sighted. And so to Zara's point, it's really important that we, as a community, are culturally sensitive because, you know what, when I moved from London working in finance to New York, same employer, same industry, same person, same eyes, I was trying to say to people in offices in New York, like getting my social security card, for example, I am partially sighted. And I got a blank what sounded like a blank stare. And I kept pressing these buttons, you know, visually impaired, partially sighted, I might not see that well. It didn't work until I suddenly realized the words I need to use to press the button to make the system churn around and receive me and give me the accommodation I needed was very distasteful to me, legally blind. I did not want to use that term. I didn't. And yet I realized, to Michael's point about efficiency, I was so tired. Who in the room is tired, worn out? Anyone? Are you tired of explaining yourself, tired of being the educator in, in every conversation? So for me, efficiency really drove me to start embracing that language of legally blind. And you know what? The system started to move and we started to get things back on track. So context really matters. But what I wanted to say about language is descriptive. I have partial sight, my retina is degenerating. Under the medical model, I have impaired vision. Okay, I get that. But language is also architectural. Why? Well, we've talked about the built environment. Sinead mentioned earlier on, the built environment is a big part of our concern. Language is architectural because words build worlds. So we live in a culture, in a world where language is really shaping the experience. And so it's really important that we consider the words we use, that we're sensitive to the culture in which we're operating in. And so when language around diagnosis is used, in a hospital, I get it, right? I do want to be met by the consultants. I would love some kind of treatment for my retinal degeneration. So the language of diagnosis in that context I'm comfortable with, but taking it out into the street, into the home, into the workplace, impairment for me is medical language. It's describing my eyes. And I'm not just eyes on legs. There's more to me, there's more to us than whatever condition, whatever diagnosis we have. And so barriers-based language for me is so much more supportive, it meets me, it sees the whole person. So for me, emphasizing the barriers language, what is the barrier we face? And how do we experience disability as our body and minds interacting with that environment around us? So it shifts the burden. And so for me, thinking about our culture, our context is really important.
Thank you, Brendan. Well deserved. Sarah, one or two sentences, and then Jesus, one or 10 sentences, then we move on.
I think there's something really important in what Brandon has just said. Actually, language of diagnosis can be really empowering. When you have a word that you can use that people can Google and possibly find out what your access needs might be, like diagnosis language can be really important, but it shouldn't be what defines how you interact with someone. And I think I sometimes use my diagnostic language to help people understand what I might need. Do I want them to use that after the point where I've explained that? Probably not. I do think there's an interesting challenge, though, which I see quite a lot, which is we have a tendency to want to qualify language to say someone is severely disabled or mildly disabled. Now, part of that is because of internalized ableism and ableism that exists in society. My question would be, who gets to decide what the threshold is for any of those things? In a room full of disabled people, am I severely disabled? I don't know. In a room full of non-disabled people, probably I am. But I think there's a lot to be said about actually, as much as possible, being as factual as possible about the language you use, but trying to avoid putting any kind of particular spin on how you might understand that and letting people lead how they use the language that is ascribed to them.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Hello to everyone. So it's a pleasure for me to participate in this meeting, and thanks to the Hessel Foundation and Zero Project team. for having me. So in Spain, we have the same problem, and we are talking about that, about how to speak about persons with disability, about disability. As you know, the Spanish language is really rich. Let me share some figures. Spanish is an official language in 21 countries, not only in Europe, also in America and in Africa and Caribbean. In United States, is the second language. More than 630 million people speak Spanish worldwide. So, as you know, this is a constantly and evolving language. And so we have the same debate in the Spanish society of persons with disability. And it's a debate in some times that it's opened by the OPDs, the Organization of Persons with Disability, because also we cannot fall behind some vocabulary that is outdated and derogative terms. For instance, there in Spain, we still use it incapacity. Some people use it disabled, impairment, handicap, cripple, abnormal or subnormal. Still, we can read this vocabulary in some literatures and in some text. We don't have to go too far either, trying to be the most modern. In Spain, also, there are two terms that it's really used as functional diversity that maybe later we can talk about this term, and different abilities. And so, as you know, from the perspective of the public administration, we have to implement the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability, and as the name of the convention says, we have to use the term of persons with disability. I know that this is an important debate and is important, so I think that the best idea is Sarah told is that each person feel comfortable with the term that he want to be used.
Thank you, Jesus. I'd like to move on the discussion. For me, as a person running the Zero Project and doing a lot of publishing and research, actually it's not that simple that everyone should basically use the language that they're comfortable with, because there are two dangers in that, being a person who is not disabled. One is you constantly engage in the discussion with OPT who talk about you using the wrong language. And this is getting us in the end nowhere. The CRPD is excellent in also defining the language to use. So with the language that we're using in the Zero Project, we definitely got out of this discussion, and we did not need to constantly engage about what language we're using. No? So, and this is of course moving, that the CRPD is 20 years old, language is always evolving. But still, I would like to have your take on, is there also a danger that the discussion on language is coming back? And having said that, it's not about me or the community talking to each other. There's also an immense danger from what we experienced, that we are scaring off companies, that we are scaring off journalists who get burned when they use the wrong language. No? So the worst thing that happens to a journalist is he wants to do good, and then he gets on LinkedIn or wherever he publishes something, everyone is complaining that he's incompetent because he's using the wrong language. No? So I would like to have your take on this, and would like to start with you, Brendan, and then you, Sarah.
Thank you, Michael. And we were chatting in the preparatory call about the idioms. You know, I don't want to turn a blind eye to idioms, nor do I. What's another one, Sarah? I think all these...
Blind leading the blind?
Oh yeah, the blind's leading the blind again, okay. Are we allowed to use these or not? So in this question of risk and danger, I run a lot with Achilles International, and we're all visually impaired and blind and legally blind and illegally blind, and we use these terms all the time. See you next week, see you at the run, it was lovely to see you. None of us can see each other, you know? So there's something in the culture that we use the language as a tool. It's a way to communicate meaning, affection, intimacy, camaraderie, but language also encodes power. So why is blindness associated with ignorance? Why is vision associated with wisdom? That's to do with the fossils of language that we have inherited essentially over millennia in all of our languages, in all the countries from which we come. So for me, I feel that as leaders in the disability space, we have power. And we need to choose which battles we're going to fight. And personally, I feel exhausted with the day-to-day battles, those itty-bitty battles, because by the end of an itty-bitty day of battling with people over visually impaired, vision impaired, partially sighted, I'm worn out. I have no energy left to enjoy life, to plan for the future. I'm exhausted. And so what I'm trying to do, and what I'd love to share as an encouragement is to make a choice ourselves as a community, not to waste our energy on too much itty-bitty battles, not to say we should absorb all this language that's disabling, but that we should preserve, number one, our own power and go for the strategic targets, go after those strategic hits and use our power in a very focused and targeted way. That's where we'll make the change. And of course, a little bit of itty-bitty battles is good to have, a little bit of education here and there, but let's conserve our energy because we have some really big battles. We need the entire power of our community, and we need to go after those systems and change them.
I have a slight challenge, but also an agreement. I think words do have power. And one of the ways that I think they have power is to bring people into our movement, to allow people to feel that they belong and that they are seen. One of the reasons, as a very visually disabled person, I'm in a wheelchair, I talk about being neurodivergent, is that often being neurodivergent is something that is not seen in rooms. And actually, by using the terms, by talking about it, by using language, we increase the dialogue that happens around disability. That being said, I think it's really important that we use language in a way that allows everyone to be seen. So for me, I am very keen, kind of building on what you were saying, Brandon, that we talk about people without disability or non-disabled people as the oppositional to disabled or people with disability. Because for me, there are lots and lots of disabled people who are able-bodied, who are quote unquote normal, at least looking, but actually the reality is that disabled people are very diverse. We don't all look like we're disabled people, and we should be using language that supports people to sit with their power, to sit with their lived experience, and to be comfortable to use that. And if that means using words that make people feel like they belong, to me that's really important.
Thank you, Sarah. So, Jesus, we talked a lot about efficiency, we talked about power, we talked about language as a tool. It's most important also from your perspective in the terminology that you're using in public administration. Could you share some concrete examples from your experience where language has been absolutely central to achieving when you're a policymaker?
Okay, that's a good question. So let me share 3 actions, concrete actions that we have put on the way in the policies for persons with disability in Spain. No? One, it was that we consider that it's not only important the vocabulary that we have to use, also how to refer to persons with disability. And how to speak with them and how to speak to them. And there is a special disability that we consider that is in the last of the lane of disabilities is the persons with intellectual disability. So it's really important to have the right writer text and the text in easy read for these persons. And so in 2011, the public administration in Spain, we released some text in easy read text in order to persons with intellectual disability, some texts like the convention, like the legal framework, Spanish framework for persons with disability, in order to be a comprehensive text and an understanding text for persons with intellectual disability. But as the other accessibility measures, all of these kind of accessible measures are comfortable for the rest of the population, no? And not only for persons with disabilities, good to use the easy read, sorry. Also for foreign people, for elder people, for persons who didn't manage a concrete vocabulary, and so it's a good way for the rest of population. The second one is how are the news refers to persons with disability. And so in 2018, we released the name of this text is a disability language style guide for media, in order to check how the media refers to persons with disability. And we detected that some news refers only in bad situations, speak and put the accent talking about persons with disability in a bad situation. And so relation the disability with a big problem, okay? And the third action that is really important for us in Spain, it has been the reform of the Constitution. In Spain, till 2024, still we used an outdated term, and so we update the Constitution. It was a difficult way to get it, because we had to put in the same opinion to all the parties, and then we reformed the Constitution, the Spanish Constitution, the Article 49, not only for vocabulary to update and to use, as the convention said, the persons with disability term, also to refers to women and young people with disability. That is important to also to put the accent over them.
Before I ask my colleagues to come in here, I would like to ask you a follow-up question. When you're policy making, when you're writing or editing regulations, usually this is embedded in something different than the disability issue itself. You talk about infrastructure, it's about building codes, and sometimes it's also not referring to persons with disabilities alone, but it's also about diversity or general human rights issues. Anything that comes to your mind from your experience of what this means for using the right language, or what definitely works and what creates, in the end, an efficient law and efficient regulation?
Yeah, we consider that it's important to use the persons with disability in order to translate, have that other points of the administration, other ministries, other units in the public administration, they concern also about persons with disability. But it's important that 3 actions has been participating with the persons of disability, the organization of persons with disability. It's really important to have the opinion, the voice, and to listen and to take account the opinion of persons with disability. And so they decide how is the correct word to use in each case. But it's important in order to raise the awareness of the rest of administration according to the convention and, of course, of the legal Spanish legal framework with persons with disability.
Just one very short question to clarify. If you're in doubt, you stick to persons with disabilities, and only if needed, then you try to use something else. But basically, your main strategy is to use the term person with disabilities. Yes. Yeah, okay. Sarah, I think you want to come in.
I think it's very interesting because the UN Convention is 20 years old. And if I think about what we were doing 20 years ago, things like AI, things that we now take for granted weren't even in existence. And I think there will come language that surpasses what was written in the convention eventually, because language does evolve. We do not use the same language that we did 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and I think we need to make sure that there is space for that evolution, which is a challenge, particularly for policymakers. And I think it goes kind of to the medical adage of do no harm. If you're using language that is doing harm to people, then you should probably stop it. But if your language is not doing any harm, then it's kind of tolerable. But that will change over time as to what we consider to be harmful or not.
Thank you. Looking at the clock, we have 6 minutes 30 to go. I would like to, before asking you for your final statements, a question to Sarah, which is about the newly evolving and becoming quite popular term of neurodivergence, neurodivergent, neurodiverse, neurodiversity. So explain to us where this comes from and what this is all about.
So I quite frequently get asked to do neurodiversity training because everyone thinks that when they're asking for neurodiversity training, they're asking about the neurodivergent folk. The reality is, neurodiversity is this room. It is the fact that all human beings think differently, that we are not robots, that we are diverse in the way we react to situations. When I say I'm neurodivergent, that is because I have an impairment or condition that means that I think significantly outside of the bell curve. I process information in a way that is significantly outside of what people would consider neurotypical. Now, for me, I think this is amazing because it means that rather than having two sequential circles in how I process the world, I get a star shape. So there are things that I am much better at as a neurodivergent person than the rest of the population. There are also things that I am much, much worse at. And I think one of the things that's important is to not confuse neurodiversity, which is the whole of humanity, with neurodivergence, because the really important thing about people identifying as neurodivergent is they're signaling to you that they might need your support to be able to process what's going on in the environment, or they might need the environment to look different or feel different to be able to be there. I was really quite jealous when I discovered that, for example, in Germany, there is already an easy German that exists. In the English language, there isn't a uniformed approach to language. And as someone that's neurodivergent, while I have not got what would be termed as an intellectual disability, I do find processing information more challenging than other people. I love easy language version summaries. I will read those first before I go to the standard text because actually it makes it more accessible.
Thank you, Sarah. Just one, keep the mark. Just one question to clarify. You definitely prefer this vocabulary related to neurodivergence to this old language of psychosocial disability. So if you're using that one now.
That's my personal preference. Again, I think that everyone has the right to use the terminology that they want to, and I think it goes back to sometimes impairment descriptions are useful even within the neurodivergent community. If you put everyone that could use the badge of neurodivergent in a room together, it would be hell because some of us want it loud, some of us want it quiet, some of us want it visual, some of us want it auditory. And actually, it's about being able to identify that we might want things differently and using the language that best explains that to the wider population.
Thank you, Sarah. Brendan, anything you want to mention as your closing words that you...
Sure. With my coaching hat on, fear is natural. Fear of hearing the wrong word, being hit with the wrong word, fear of being labeled, fear of using the wrong word, very natural. Silence, from my perspective, is the enemy. Silence is the enemy. We need to talk. And that means we need to show up to the conversation as best as we can, whether we happen to have a disability or not, and not be silent, because silence is when everything is lost, because we can't meet this topic and actually get practice at one of many difficult conversations in the world today. This is not the only difficult conversation. So when I'm teaching at NYU, I often use this, that disability is a sandbox for mainstream leadership skills. A leader that can't talk about disability is not a leader, because leaders can meet difficult scenarios and respond effectively. So leaders that can't talk about disability, not leaders. And so what we need to do is make sure to figure out how to have that conversation. And the two skills I've found helpful is, number one, convey your intention. Here's the intention I have in this conversation. Here's what I'd like to do to be inclusive. Be clear in our intention. And number two, I should say, receptivity. Ask the other person. So as we heard from Jesus and Zara and myself and Michael, you know, this curiosity is really important. So if in doubt, silence is the enemy. Convey your clear intention and ask the other person. And with that set of ingredients, it should be a good dialogue.
Thank you, Brendan. Jesus, your final take.
Yes, I agree with Sarah. So the language is constantly evolving. So today we are talking about a vocabulary, but maybe in the next 10 years we talk about another words and another terms to refer to persons with disability. There in Spain in 2005, we started to listen a new term, is functional diversity. From the public policies, we have to address our policies to the rest of the population, not only for the population with disability that are living with disability. In Spain, it's around 10% of persons has a kind of disability. 25% of the families live with one member with disability, and so we have to address the message, the policies, to the rest of the population. And it's important not to confuse the rest of the population that they don't have contact with persons with disability, today using one word and tomorrow another and different terms. So it's really important to have, maybe I don't know how many times, but to use the same terms, and today the legal framework is persons with disability.
Thank you, my fellow panelists. This concludes this session on using the right language, and give all of them please a warm applause. Thank you.